Della Marsh had spent most of her adult life learning exactly how much space she was allowed to take up. And the answer, in nearly every room she'd ever entered, had been as little as possible. She was a big woman in a city that loved to comment on big women. Soft through the middle and the hips, in a way that drew stares. She'd trained herself to stop noticing. Or at least to stop letting show on her face. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight for work, kept her uniform pressed, even when the fabric strained at the seams, and had perfected, over a decade of waiting tables, the particular art of being useful enough to need and invisible enough to overlook. The bell above the door of Bayou Grace Diner jingled sharply, and every fork in the restaurant stopped moving at once. Della felt the temperature of the room drop before she even turned around. The specific electric hush that fell over New Orleans whenever the Moreau name walked through a door. She'd been refilling sweet tea at table 6, and she kept her eyes down, kept her hands steady. Because in 6 months of working this shift, she had learned exactly one rule about powerful. Dangerous men never be the one who looks too interested. Antoine Moreau moved through the dining room like whether nobody had been warned about tall. Broad through the shoulders in a way his tailored black suit did nothing to soften. Dark hair pushed back from a face carved into something permanently, exhaustedly grim. 2 enormous men flanked him, and behind them came a custom triple stroller pushed by a young nanny who looked one bad moment away from bursting into tears herself. The triplets were already screaming. Della had heard about the Moreau babies the way everyone in the quarter had heard about them whispered over coffee. Traded like gossip currency. 6 months since Isabella Moreau had died in a car wreck on the causeway. 7 months pregnant. The official story calling it an accident, and absolutely no one in this city believing that for a second, the triplets had come early, violently early, delivered by emergency surgery while their mother lay dying, and had spent 10 weeks fighting for their lives in the NICU at Oxner before anyone let them go home. Since then, according to the rumors, they had gone through 11 nannies. 11. None of them lasted more than 2 weeks. The babies screamed at strangers, screamed at family, screamed, apparently, at anyone who wasn't their father. And Antoine Moreau, a man who ran half the shipping traffic moving through the port of New Orleans and, according to whispers Della had learned not to repeat out loud, considerably more than shipping had not slept a full night in 6 months. The manager, a nervous, balding man named Frank, physically shoved a tray of ice water into Della's hands before she could protest. "You're up," Frank hissed. "Nobody else will go near that table. Frank, you want a job tomorrow." "Della." "You go." Della sighed and carried the tray toward the corner booth, her aching feet protesting every step, her tired mind already composing the polite, invisible small talk she'd perfected over a decade of being the largest, least noticed woman in every room she entered. She wasn't afraid of Antoine Moreau. Not really. There was a particular kind of fearlessness that came from having already survived the worst thing that could happen to you. And 18 months ago, Della had buried a pregnancy she'd wanted more than anything in the world. Alone. After the father had disappeared the moment she told him, men in expensive suits held very little power over a woman who had already lost everything that actually mattered. She set the water down. The triplets were in full meltdown, one boy wailing red-faced in his seat, the other kicking furiously at the stroller's frame, the little girl hiccuping through tears too big for her tiny face. Antoine sat with his elbows on the table, and his head in his hands. And for one unguarded second, the most feared man in the parish just looked like an exhausted father who hadn't slept in half a year. Della didn't think about it. She just reacted. The way 10 weeks in a NICU rocking chair years ago had trained some deep, automatic part of her to react. She began to hum. It wasn't a real song. Not exactly a low, wandering melody she'd once hummed for hours at a time to babies who weren't hers. Back when she'd volunteered as an infant cuddler at Oxner during the worst stretch of her own grief. Back when holding some other frightened, fragile creature through the night had been the only thing keeping her upright. She hadn't hummed it in months. She didn't even realize she'd started until the boy in the middle seat went suddenly. Completely silent, the whole table turned toward her. The wailing girl hiccuped once more, then stilled, tiny fists uncurling. The second boy stopped kicking, his small face swiveling toward Della with an intensity that seemed impossible in a child his age. Antoine lifted his head slowly, his dark eyes tracking the sudden silence with visible disbelief. I'm sorry, Della stammered, immediately self-conscious under the weight of 4 sets of eyes. I didn't mean to intrude. The boy in the middle seat reached both arms toward her, fingers grasping at empty air, and said, with startling, crystal clarity, a single word that stopped every conversation in the restaurant dead. Mama. The second boy echoed it instantly. Mama, Mama. The little girl squealed with delight, bouncing in her seat, adding her own small voice to the chorus. Antoine Moreau went very, very still. Della felt her pulse roar in her ears. That's I promise you. I've never met these children in my life. I don't know why they said that. I just hummed a little. I didn't. They have never spoken a word. Antoine said, his voice low and dangerously quiet. Dark eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floor. Not one. Not to me. Not to their nanny. Not to my own mother. 11 nannies. 6 specialists. He rose slowly from the booth, towering, the 2 men flanking him, tensing on instinct. And they say their first word to a stranger clearing plates. I'm not, Della started. But the boy was still reaching for her. Insistent. And against every instinct, telling her to back away. She found herself stepping forward, letting his small hand close around one of her fingers. Donovan, Antoine said, without looking away from her. His scarred underboss appeared instantly at his elbow. Find out everything about her. Name. History. Everything. 1 hour. Please. Della said, panic finally cutting through the strange, magnetic pull of the moment. I just work here. I don't want any trouble. Something moved behind Antoine's eyes, not softening exactly, but a recalculation. The look of a man rewriting an assumption in real time. Then you have nothing to worry about, he said. Quiet and final, because I intend to find out exactly why my children just called you their mother. Miss Marsh, Della whispered. De la Marsh. Miss Marsh, Antoine repeated. And something in the careful, deliberate way he said her name made the back of her neck prickle with a feeling she refused to name. We are going to have a great deal to discuss. The heavy oak doors of Antoine's study closed with a solid, final thud, sealing the room in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of the fireplace. Della sat rigid in a velvet armchair, still wearing her stained diner apron, painfully aware of how out of place she looked against the mahogany and crystal surrounding her. Antoine stood by the window, a glass of untouched bourbon in one hand, staring out at the lights of the Garden District. "You volunteered at Oxner," he said finally, without turning around. "Infant Cuddler Program. 18 months ago. For a period of 11 weeks. Della's stomach dropped. "How do you? I told you I would find out everything." He turned. Finally, his expression unreadable. "My children were born 10 weeks premature, delivered the night their mother died. They spent those 10 weeks in the NICU fighting to survive, while I was consumed with finding out who ran her car off the causeway and burying the woman I'd been married to for 6 years. I was not there every night. I could not be. My mother tried. My sister tried. There was a rotation of volunteers who held the babies when family couldn't anonymous. Unpaid. Entirely off the record, for security reasons. Because the last thing I needed was the world knowing exactly where my most vulnerable moment lived." His jaw tightened. Donovan pulled the shift logs. "You held my son, Elias, for 4 to 6 hours a night. 3 nights a week. For 11 weeks straight. You were his primary point of human contact during the most critical window of his development. The same for his brother and sister on alternating nights." Della's throat closed. "I didn't know whose babies they were. The program keeps everything anonymous for the parents' privacy. They said, I just knew there were 3 of them. In the same pod. Fighting so hard. And nobody came for them most nights. And I," her voice cracked, "I'd just lost a pregnancy of my own. 22 weeks. I couldn't sit at home anymore. I needed somewhere to put all that love that didn't have anywhere left to go. So I went and I held babies who needed holding. That's all it ever was. Silence stretched between them. Thick and unbearable. When Antoine finally spoke, his voice had lost its hard edge entirely. You hummed to them. Every night. The nurses noted it in the file. Infant appears to calm significantly during volunteers' presence. Unique vocal pattern observed. It's not even a real song. Della said, wiping at her eyes. It's just something my grandmother used to hum to me. I didn't think it meant anything. It meant everything. Antoine said quietly, It is. Apparently. The only sound in the last 6 months that has ever made my children feel safe. He crossed the room slowly and sat in the chair across from her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion carved into every line of his face. The 6 months of grief and rage he'd clearly been carrying entirely alone. I need to ask you something, Miss Marsh. And I need you to understand I am not a man who asks easily. Okay, come work for me. Live at the estate. Help me raise them. His eyes held hers. Dark and direct. I have buried a wife under circumstances I still do not fully understand. I have 11 failed nannies and 3 children who have not said a word to another living soul until tonight. I do not know how to fix what is broken in this house, but I know, with absolute certainty, that whatever it is you did in that NICU, it is the only thing that has worked in half a year. You're a waitress, Mr. Moreau, Della said, though something in her chest, that same aching, unused reservoir of love she'd carried since losing her own baby, had already begun leaning toward, yes, I don't know anything about your world. I don't know anything about being whatever it is you're asking me to be. I'm not asking you to be anything you aren't already, Antoine said, low and certain. I watched 3 children who have refused every trained professional in this city reach for you within 30 seconds of hearing your voice. I don't need you to understand my world. Della, I need you to keep doing exactly what you were already doing. In a house where you'll be paid properly and treated with the respect 11 weeks of anonymous volunteering never earned you. And if I say no, she asked quietly, if this is too much, then I will thank you for tonight. Pay you generously for your trouble. And find some other way to survive this. Antoine said. And something in the flat honesty of it struck her harder than any persuasion could have. I am not a man who forces the people around him into anything. Miss Marsh, whatever the city may whisper about the rest of my business, my children have had enough, taken from them, without their consent. I refuse to be the reason you feel the same. He paused. Studying her face with the same careful attention, he seemed to give everything that mattered to him. I recognize I am asking a great deal of a woman I met 4 hours ago. I do not make the request lightly. And I will not think less of you if the answer is no. Della studied him for a long moment, the exhaustion carved into his face. The careful, deliberate way he'd laid out the truth without softening any of it. The total absence of the performative charm she might have expected from a man in his position. I need to think, she admitted. Not because I don't want to help them, because I do. More than I know how to explain. And that scares me more than anything about you or this house ever could. Take the night, Antoine said. The offer will still stand in the morning. She took the night. She lay awake in her small apartment above a laundromat on Dauphine Street, staring at the water-stained ceiling, thinking about 11 weeks of rocking strangers' babies in a plastic hospital chair because it was the only thing that had kept her own grief from swallowing her whole. Thinking about 3 small faces that had gone half a year without a single word until hers was the one that reached them. By sunrise, she had her answer, and it had very little to do with the money. The weeks that followed unfolded with a speed that left Della dizzy. A wing of the Moreau estate, all soft, light, and nursery pastels. Entirely unlike the cold marble grandeur of the rest of the house, became hers. And the babies. In equal measure, Elias, Theo, and baby Camille, who had gone 6 months without speaking a single word to anyone, began talking in earnest within days of Della's arrival. Their vocabularies exploding, the way toddlers sometimes do, once the right kind of safety finally settles into their small bodies. It was, Antoine noted more than once, precisely the contrast in Della that seemed to unsettle and fascinate him in equal measure. In the enormous, unfamiliar house, she was almost comically out of her depth. She got lost twice trying to find the kitchen, tripped over an ornamental rug in the east hallway, apologized reflexively to the housekeeper for existing in the same room, but hand her a screaming, inconsolable infant at 3 a.m, or ask her to read the subtle, exhausted signals of 3 toddlers on the edge of a meltdown, and something in her transformed entirely steady hands. A flat, calm voice. An instinct for exactly which child needed to be held and which needed space that put every credentialed specialist Antoine had hired to shame. The staff noticed it too. Maria, the estate's longtime housekeeper, who had watched 11 nannies come and go in 6 exhausting months, took to leaving small kindnesses in Della's path, a fresh pot of chicory coffee left warming by the nursery door each morning, a note tucked into a laundry basket, letting her know Camille preferred her blanket, folded a particular way. Even Donovan, a man built almost entirely of scar tissue and suspicion, began greeting her each morning with something that might, in a less guarded man, have qualified as warmth. "You did 4 years of early childhood coursework," Antoine said one evening, watching her expertly diffuse a 3-way toddler crisis over a single stuffed alligator with the calm authority of a hostage negotiator. Before the restaurant, I saw it in the file Donovan pulled. I wanted to be a pediatric nurse, Della admitted, wrapping the now calm alligator dispute participants into a joint blanket fort. Financial aid fell through my sophomore year. My mother got sick. Then I got pregnant. Then I lost the baby. Then waitressing was just easier. Something I could do without thinking too hard about what I'd actually wanted. She glanced up at him. I didn't expect to ever use any of it again. I find that to be the most interesting thing about you, Antoine said. Quiet. And I include the way you make my children speak in that assessment. He told her things in careful fragments. The way men who guarded everything only released information. They trusted a person to carry responsibly. That Isabella's death had never sat right with him. The causeway crash, investigated and closed within a week. No skid marks. No mechanical failure found. A convenient tragedy that had happened 3 days after Isabella discovered financial irregularities in the shipping ledgers her husband's own cousin managed. That he suspected, without yet being able to prove it, that his wife had not died in an accident at all. Della told him about the 22 weeks she'd carried a daughter she'd already named. About waking up in a hospital bed with no baby and no father in sight. About the specific, hollowing grief of loving something the world decided she didn't get to keep. Antoine listened, the way almost no one in her life ever had, without flinching. Without rushing to fill the silence. Simply present with the weight of it beside her. "Do you ever resent it?" he asked her once. The two of them sitting on the nursery floor, after finally wrestling all 3 children to sleep. A bottle of wine between them that neither had touched much. That the world decided you should disappear into the background of every room. That you learned to make yourself smaller instead of demanding people simply look. Every day. For a long time, Della admitted. Then I got tired of being angry at people who were never going to change their minds. So I just got quiet about it instead. Quiet felt safer than angry. She glanced sideways at him. You don't strike me as a man who's ever had to make himself smaller for anyone. No. Antoine agreed. But I have spent 6 months making myself very carefully controlled, which is its own kind of disappearing. Grief and rage require an enormous amount of performance if you intend to keep running an empire while you carry them. A pause. Quieter. You are the only person in this house who has not once asked me to perform anything. I find I did not realize how exhausted I was until I stopped having to. He looked down at the wine glass between them, turning it slowly by the stem. My father used to say a man in my position could afford exactly 2 honest relationships in his life, his children, and whoever he chose to build a home with. Everyone else gets the version of him that keeps the business intact. I did not understand what he meant until Isabella died, and I realized how few people in my life I had ever actually let see me unguarded. 6 weeks into her new life at the estate, the Port Authority's annual maritime gala arrived, an event Antoine was contractually and politically obligated to attend, and one he asked Della, with unusual hesitation, to attend beside him. I don't have anything to wear to something like that. Della said, panic fluttering immediately in her chest at the thought of 300 of New Orleans' wealthiest families examining her the way the world always seemed to examine her. And I don't know how to talk to senators. Antoine, I know how to talk to toddlers and diner regulars. You'll have something to wear, Antoine said. And 2 days later, a garment bag arrived from a design house on Magazine Street, containing a floor-length gown in deep burgundy silk, cut by a designer who had taken Della's measurements over the phone with brisk, matter-of-fact professionalism and not a single flicker of the polite discomfort she'd learned to expect from anyone holding a tape measure near her body. The dress didn't try to minimize her. It simply fit beautifully, following every curve of her rather than apologizing for them. She stood in front of her mirror a long time before putting it on, thinking about a decade of ordering the smallest thing on every menu in public, of standing at the back of every photograph, of ducking her head every time someone's eyes lingered a beat too long. Then she zipped the dress and looked at herself fully and did not flinch. When she came downstairs, Antoine was waiting at the bottom of the staircase in his tuxedo, and whatever he'd been about to say about the gala's guest list died somewhere behind his teeth entirely. Say something, Della said, half laughing, suddenly nervous under the weight of his attention. I am choosing my words carefully, he said, low, because Donovan is standing directly behind me, and the first several words that came to mind were not appropriate for polite company. He crossed to her, took her hand, pressed a kiss to her knuckles with a formality that felt entirely sincere. You look like exactly who you are. Della. I only wish the rest of this city had figured that out before I did. 3 months into Della's life at the estate, Cousin Bertrand, Moreau, Antoine's second cousin, the family's long-time logistics manager, a man Della had met exactly twice and instinctively disliked, both times, began appearing at the house with increasing, unwelcome frequency, always with some pretext about shipping manifests, always watching Della and the children with a cold, assessing a tension that made her skin crawl. He doesn't like me, Della mentioned once, mostly in passing. Folding tiny laundry in the nursery, Bertrand doesn't like anyone who might displace him in the family's plans. Antoine said, distracted, reviewing a stack of manifests himself. He's efficient. Isabella never trusted him, though she never told me why before she died. He didn't look up from the papers. Della let it go, telling herself it was nothing. The same old instinct that had spent a lifetime being told her feelings about people mattered less than everyone else's certainty. There had been other small things too. In the weeks before, that Della noticed and dismissed the way people always dismiss small things until they turn out to matter enormously. Bertrand asking, too casually, exactly which nights Antoine typically worked late at the docks. Bertrand lingering near the nursery wing on visits that had no legitimate reason to bring him anywhere near it. Bertrand's cold, assessing eyes, tracking Della across every room she entered, cataloging rather than admiring, 2 days before everything fell apart. Della found Bertrand alone in Antoine's study, standing over the very shipping ledgers Isabella had supposedly died over, photographing pages on his phone with quick, practiced efficiency. Antoine asked me to reconcile some of the older Cicero manifests, Bertrand said smoothly, not even startled at being caught, sliding the phone into his jacket pocket. Family business. Miss Marsh, nothing that concerns the help. I'm not the help, Della said. Before she could stop herself, something old and stubborn rising in her chest. I live here. I raise his children. Bertrand's smile went thin and cold. For now, he said, and left without another word. And Della stood alone in the study for a long moment afterward. The cold drop in her stomach, refusing to fully explain itself, even as every instinct screamed that something was deeply wrong. It happened on a Thursday night. 6 weeks later, Antoine had been called away to the docks for an emergency shipment inspection, leaving the estate under the watch of the evening security shift. Della was in the nursery, humming Camille to sleep, when the mansion's alarm system erupted into a shrieking, flashing red alert. Donovan burst through the nursery door, his jacket torn, blood on his knuckles. Bertrand's men breached the east perimeter. They're inside. Della, you have to move the children now. How many? Della asked, already moving toward the emergency bag. Her voice startlingly steady, even as her hands shook. 6, maybe 8. We're outnumbered on this floor. Donovan pressed a small pistol into her free hand. One she'd never fired and prayed she wouldn't need to, just in case. Adrenaline flooded her system. But it did not paralyze her, it sharpened her. The way it always did. The way 10 weeks in a NICU had once trained some deep, automatic part of her brain to function precisely when everything else fell apart. She grabbed the emergency bag Antoine had insisted she keep packed by the crib, loaded all 3 terrified children inside with the speed and precision of someone who had rehearsed this 100 times in her mind, and slung it across her back. The panic room. Donovan started. They'll know about the panic room if Bertrand's been managing the security contracts. Della said, already moving. We go up. Roof access. Maintenance stairwell. She didn't wait for confirmation. Pushing past him into the service corridor, just as heavy boots pounded up the marble staircase behind them, they reached the steel roof door, with Bertrand's men closing fast. Della shoved the children's bag through first, turning to help Donovan barricade the stairwell. When a shadow detached itself from the darkness at the top of the stairs, Bertrand himself, weapon raised, his aristocratic face twisted into something ugly and triumphant. Look at you, Bertrand sneered, eyes raking over her with open contempt. Antoine's little waitress, playing nanny to heirs that should have been mine to control, the moment Isabella's accident cleared the path. Move aside. I only need the children silenced. Not you, though I'm inclined to make an exception, given how thoroughly you've inserted yourself into my inheritance. You killed her, Della said, understanding crashing over her all at once. Cold and absolute. Isabella, the causeway. That wasn't an accident. She found the ledgers 3 days too early. Bertrand said, almost bored. Some inconveniences simply require correction. Now move, or I correct you as well. Della felt Camille whimper softly against her back through the fabric of the bag, and something in her chest went hard and immovable. The exact same fierce, wordless certainty she remembered from 22 weeks of carrying a daughter she never got to hold. She did not move. She planted herself squarely in the doorway between Bertrand and the children. Every soft, doubted, underestimated part of her body, suddenly, ferociously certain of exactly one thing. You'll have to go through me. Bertrand's finger tightened on the trigger. The roar that answered was not entirely human. Antoine Moreau came up the stairwell like something unleashed, flanked by 4 of his men, drenched in dock water and fury. And before Bertrand could fully turn, Antoine fired a single shot that ended the confrontation with brutal, final efficiency. The silence afterward was absolute. Antoine crossed the roof in 3 strides and pulled Della and the bag of children into his arms all at once, his whole massive frame shaking. "I have you," he said hoarsely, into her hair. "I have you. All of you. You're safe." Della clung to him, adrenaline finally draining out of her system in violent waves. 3 small, warm bodies pressed safely between them. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The 4 of them simply breathing in the cool night air on the rooftop. The city's lights spread out below, indifferent to how close everything had just come to shattering. Donovan slumped against the doorframe behind them, pressing a hand to a shallow cut along his ribs, already barking orders into a radio to secure the rest of the estate. "You could have run," Antoine said finally, pulling back just far enough to look at her. Disbelief, and something fiercer than gratitude, warring in his expression. "You had a clear path to the stairwell. You chose to stand in that doorway instead. They're my children, too," Della said, simple and unshaken, the truth of it settling into her chest, with a certainty she hadn't fully claimed out loud until that moment. "Whatever that makes me to you, Antoine. It made the decision for me." The second Bertrand raised that gun, something in his face broke open entirely at that, unguarded in a way she had never once seen from him, and he pressed his forehead to hers and simply held on. The 2 of them and 3 small children wrapped together on a rooftop, while the city exhaled beneath them. The following morning, sunlight spilled gold across the estate's dining room, and Della sat with Camille on one knee, feeding Theo a spoonful of oatmeal, while Elias narrated an elaborate, mostly incomprehensible story about a dragon. Antoine watched from the doorway for a long moment before crossing to sit beside her, his hand finding the small of her back, the way it had every day since the roof. Neither of them had slept more than a few hours. Donovan had spent the early hours coordinating with a handful of quietly trusted contacts in the department to ensure the official record reflected exactly enough truth to close the matter without inviting further scrutiny. A home invasion, a family dispute turned violent, a tragic loss of life. The details would satisfy the world outside the estate's walls. What had actually happened would remain, like so much else in Antoine's life, contained within the family itself. "You never told me the ending of your dragon story," Della said, smiling at Elias, who beamed back at her with his father's exact dark eyes. "I'm more interested," Antoine said quietly, near her ear, "in the ending of ours." He reached into his jacket and set the same small velvet box from weeks earlier on the table, between the oatmeal and the dragon debris. Not opening it yet, simply letting it sit there. A quiet promise, rather than a demand. "I told myself I would wait until you were ready to see this. I find, after last night, that I no longer want to wait quite as patiently as I intended." "Antoine, I am not asking tonight," he said again, gently, though his eyes said something considerably more certain than his words. "I know you need time, and I intend to give you every bit of it you require. But I watched you stand in a doorway last night and tell a man with a gun that he would have to go through you to reach my children. I have commanded soldiers who would not have done that. Della, I do not think I have ever, in my entire life, witnessed anything as fierce or as certain as you were in that moment. His thumb traced slowly along her jaw. Whatever this is between us, and I suspect we both know exactly what it is. Even if neither of us has said the word yet, I do not intend to spend the rest of my life pretending it is anything less than permanent. Della looked at the box. Then at him. Then at the three small faces around the table who had gone 6 months without a single word and now would not stop talking. All of it, because of a hum she hadn't even realized. She still remembered. She thought about 18 months of grief carried alone. Of a decade spent making herself as small and unremarkable as the world seemed to demand. Of every version of herself that had learned quiet was safer than wanted. I spent so long believing love was something that happened to other people. She said softly. Smaller people. Prettier people. People who didn't take up as much space as I do. She reached for his hand instead of the box, lacing her fingers through his. I don't know how to do this gracefully. Antoine, I've never been given the chance to try. Then we'll do it clumsily. Together. Antoine said. Something almost like a smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. I find I am not particularly graceful myself. Whatever the suits suggest. He glanced down at Theo, who had abandoned his oatmeal entirely in favor of methodically dismantling a napkin. Though I suspect our children will provide ample instruction in clumsiness for both of us, should we ever require a refresher. Della laughed. Real and unguarded. The sound surprising, even herself. I think I can live with that curriculum. Elias, entirely unbothered by the significance of the moment unfolding above his oatmeal, threw a piece of toast directly at his father's head and declared, with the absolute confidence of a child who had finally found his words, Mama, Dada, kiss. Antoine caught the toast without looking, his eyes never leaving Della's face. And for the first time in 6 months, the most feared man in New Orleans laughed low. Real. Entirely unguarded before he leaned in and did exactly what his son had ordered. Outside the tall windows of the dining room, the city was waking up the way it always did. Indifferent to the small, seismic shift that had taken place within those walls. Overnight, a woman who had spent a lifetime learning to disappear, finally choosing, in the quiet gold light of an ordinary morning, to stay exactly where she was wanted. Camille reached up and patted Della's cheek with one small, sticky hand, babbling something that might have been a word and might have simply been joy. And Della held her closer, and did not, for the first time in longer than she could remember, feel the old urge to apologize for the space she filled.